Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today's session on deployment readiness for Teams devices. My name is Craig Chiffers. I'm a senior Teams subject matter expert here at Microsoft. I'm based in our Fast Track Centre in sunny Australia. In fact, very sunny because I've just moved up to Brisbane, recent addition to Brisbane. So I'm getting used to the warmth up here at the moment. If you're keen on keeping track of the kinds of things that I like to blog about or record videos such as this about, you can follow me on Twitter, or I guess as it's known as X now, at @cchiffers, or check out the blog at blog.chiffers.com. So today's goal is to hopefully have you leave today's session with a better understanding of what prereqs or prerequisites are required for you to ready your environment for Teams devices. When we're talking Teams devices, we mean Teams meeting room devices and Teams phones. So hopefully after today's session, you'll know exactly what you need to configure in your environment to better support those devices and get your environment ready for your Teams device rollout. Now, in terms of those prereqs, there's really four key areas that we're going to focus on today. So starting top left there, the devices themselves, ensuring, of course, that the devices that you choose are Teams certified devices. We're also going to talk about the network as well. Of course, the network piece is vitally important. It's what connects your devices to the service, so ensuring that low latency, direct access where possible to those service URLs is provided. We're also going to talk about enrolling the devices in Intune and the prereqs and what bits and pieces are required to get them up and running inside of Intune. And of course, how to secure and provide access to those devices should you have conditional access configured in your environment as well. But as always, a really good place to start is devices. You've probably heard me harp on about devices before. It's really important, though, that the devices that you choose to roll out in your environment are Teams certified devices. Now, if you go to aka.ms/Teams devices, that'll take you to a page that looks very similar to this. You'll be able to filter by the type of device. Of course, today's session focuses on Teams Rooms devices and telephones as well. Just ensure any equipment that you're purchasing for your rooms appears on this list, so you know that it is certified for Teams and that it will work and is ready to go. All right, that's devices done. Let's talk about the network. So first of all, if you've got Android devices in your environment or you're about to roll out Teams phones or Teams Android devices in your rooms, it's really important that your devices are able to bypass your proxy if you have one today in your environment. Now, the reason for that is on the device itself, there are 3 different services that run. You've got, obviously, of course, the Android OS. Then on top of that, you've got the Teams application itself. That's the bit that your end users kind of interact with. That's what shows up on the screen there. You've got the company portal app, which communicates with Intune to download configuration policies, compliance policies, and to enroll itself in Intune. And then you've got the Teams Admin Center app, and that is what communicates with the Teams Admin Center to provide the health status of the phone, as well as trigger things like firmware updates. Now, the Teams Admin Center app today does not support proxy servers. In fact, it ignores any proxy settings that you put on the device. That's why we always recommend to customers to bypass our Office 365 URLs from the proxy and send them direct out the firewall and obviously across the internet or ExpressRoute if you have it up to our service. Now, if you have a Windows device, we do support simple proxies on Windows devices. However, we don't recommend them. Regardless of that, if you do require authentication on your proxy, that won't work. So we don't have any mechanisms to be able to support proxy authentication. Also, if you're running SSL encryption on your proxy or SSL inspect, you'll need to turn that off. So consider that your Teams devices, they're not domain joined, so they're not going to be able to trust your internally signed certificate that your proxy is going to give the device when it does an SSL decrypt and re-encrypt. And so that will prevent the device from obviously communicating with those URLs. So if that's enabled, turn it off. However, best practice advice is just bypass the proxy altogether for Teams traffic. Just a little bit more on network as well. First of all, when it comes to DNS, it's really important that DNS resolution happens as close to the end user as possible. Now, that's okay if that occurs in country. Where we start to see people having problems with this, though, is that if DNS is occurring in the cloud and potentially outside of country as well. The reason for that is when your Teams device calls up the service, it reaches out to our worldwide TZ Teams load balancing service, which then returns a list of URLs and IP addresses that should be close to the user to get the user connected to the closest service front door, so on the Microsoft network as quickly as possible. That can only work well, though, if local DNS resolution is used. So ensure that local DNS resolution is used where possible. Just on that as well, ensuring that the least amount of hops are required to get data between the end user's device and our service where possible. So if you've got traffic today routing through various different data centers across various different MPLS networks, the best possible advice that we can give you is try and have that data or internet traffic leave the user's local internet egress point where possible. And also where possible, try and route that traffic, the TCP and UDP traffic flow the same way. Now, there isn't a requirement to do that, and in some cases, you don't have to do that, or that's not possible. However, it is what we would recommend. So shorten that path between the end user's device and our service where possible. To that point as well, try and avoid cloud-based proxies. So cloud proxies essentially cache details in the cloud and may end up routing TCP traffic to a service front door location that's really far away from the end user. I've seen scenarios where the service front door ends up being in another country sometimes. And of course, you can imagine that can cause all kinds of fun when it comes to Teams real-time audio and media traffic. So yes, where possible, bypass those cloud proxy services. And of course, we do have tools available that you can utilize to see how your call quality performance is occurring within your tenant and from your end users. Now, there's a couple of ways to do this. The first one is within the Teams admin center itself. So if you have a user that's sort of saying, hey, I've been having quite a few problems with my Teams calls lately. Can you have a look to see what's going on? Well, you can jump inside the Teams admin center, jump into that user and actually go back historically and view all the meetings that user took place in or took part in. And you'll be able to see what the call quality was like throughout that call. You'll also be able to see any live meetings that user is currently right now taking place or taking part in as well. That's one place to check. The second place is the call quality dashboard, or the CQD. Now, there's two ways of accessing that. The first one is via the Teams Admin Center. That gives you kind of like a kind of information text form version of all of the call quality information. If you want a simpler way of digesting that information in easy to sort of understand bar charts and graph charts and pie charts, have a look for our Teams Power BI templates. They're super easy to find. Just jump into search and type Teams Power BI templates. Download those. You'll need a copy of Power BI Desktop running on your machine, and you'll need the right permissions to access the reports as well. But once you've got access to them, that gives you a wealth of information that's pulled from the CQD and presented in a much easier to digest and understand form that not only can you utilize to sort of troubleshoot and figure out potentially where problems may be occurring within your network, but then you can also share that information internally with others as well. We've also got our connectivity.office.com test tool there. If you've not seen this before, I'll just show you what it looks like a second. So this is connectivity.office.com. This will show you where your service front door location is in terms of each of those services with Exchange and SharePoint, as well as your location as well. You can see here that the tool's reporting that my DNS is somewhere over in the east coast of the US at the moment. So that would be a concern for me that would tell me that I need to fix up my DNS server and maybe use my local ISP's DNS as opposed to, say, Google DNS, for example. You can also jump to the details tab here as well, and it will give you much more information on exactly what your machine is able to communicate with and how long it took to communicate. We can see here, for example, that it's come back and said that I'm having some problems reaching some of these URLs here. So if I was doing this on a machine internally, I would know that perhaps some of these URLs are being blocked on the firewall or the proxy, and that I need to unblock them where possible. So that's connectivity.office.com. Really useful tool there to check out. Okay, so that's the network piece done. Let's talk a little bit about Intune. Now, specifically, there's 3 areas of Intune that we need to focus on. The first one is Android Device Administrator and turning that on in the environment. Then we're going to touch on device enrollment itself. And lastly, we'll talk about compliance policies and how we can configure those and assign them to our end user devices. All right, first up, let's talk about Android Device Administrator. So the first thing that we need to do inside of Intune is ensure that Device Administrator is enabled. Now, the easiest way of doing that is just going to the Intune Admin Center, just manage.microsoft.com, signing in, go to Devices, and then Enroll Devices, and then Android Enrollment here on the left-hand side. You scroll to the bottom, you'll see there's personal and corporate owned devices with device administrator privileges. We're going to need to click that. Now, this tick box here that's grayed out for me at the moment, this needs to be ticked in your environment for now to enable Android Device Administrator. Now, today, all of our Teams devices require Android Device Administrator to be enabled. It's the only supported method that we allow today with Teams devices. Now, going forwards into the future, we have started talking about allowing AOSP. That is something that will be introduced at some point, but not for now. And also to know too that when it is introduced, you don't immediately need to enable it as well. There will be that crossover period where Android Device Administrator will continue to work. Also know too that if you have already enabled AOSP in your environment, enabling Device Administrator isn't going to cause any problems. The two are very compatible with each other. So very important to tick that box first of all and hit save. Okay, let's talk about device enrollment inside of Intune. Now, there's essentially 2 methods to support device enrollment inside of Intune to enroll your Teams devices today. And you may already be familiar with some of these because you may be doing them with other devices in your environment today. So the 2 methods that we support are corporate device identifiers and device platform restriction enrollment. Now, I've split these up. The column on the left-hand side there for corporate device identifiers, that's more of a simpler way of managing your device enrollments as you start out and as you're trialing your Teams devices. The reason I say that is because it involves adding the device serial numbers to the corporate device identifiers list inside of Intune. Now, as you can imagine, that's super simple to manage if you've got 5, 10, 15 devices. Once that list starts to grow, though, and you start rolling out large numbers of handsets and Teams room devices, that list obviously is going to get larger and larger and larger and become more difficult to manage. Now, that's why we typically recommend the solution on the right there, which is device platform restriction enrollment. Now, what this is our preferred method. You control it via restriction policy and via an Azure AD group. So what we essentially say is that every user that signs into a desk phone or our meeting room accounts will be part of an Azure Active Directory group, and then we will target that group with our restriction policy. Now, that's much easier to manage as the rollout progresses because all we simply need to do is add user accounts that need to sign into meeting rooms or desk phones into those Azure AD groups. Everything else is then automatically handled in the background. So how does this look? Well, if we jump across to Intune a second, we'll go to Devices, we'll go to Enroll Devices, and we'll have a look at corporate device identifiers first of all. So that's the easier method that I spoke about first of all. So in here today, we can go ahead and add serial numbers of devices that we want to add. So to do that, you can see I've got one listed here at the moment called Lab Phone. I can go to Enter manually. I'm going to need to choose serial number for the device because that's the only supported method for our Teams handsets or mini room devices. The identifier will then be the actual serial number of the device. So I'll just make one up here. And then the details would be the name that you'd want to give the device so that it makes sense to you, so you know what it is. So I'm just going to call this Demo Lab Phone, and then hit Add. Now that'll take a few moments to actually add that to the list, but once it's added, it will appear on the list and show up, and we'll be able to go back to our corporate device identifiers. So we'll just wait for that to save a second. And we'll be able to go back to our list and take a look, and it will show up in that list. There it is there. There's the phone that I just added there a moment ago. Now, of course, I can easily remove these from the list here if I need to as well. Just highlight it, hit delete. And there you go. That phone or device is then removed from that corporate device identifiers list. So that's a simpler way of managing these devices. Now, our preferred method is to use enrollment device platform restrictions. So we just jump in here a second. I'll show you this. So what we've got here are the different types of OSs that we support. So because this is for Android devices, we're going to create an Android restriction. So we're going to create restriction. I'm going to call this demo allow demo phones to enroll in Intune. And we're going to go next. Okay, so this is the important part here. We don't need to worry about Android Enterprise Work Profile because that's not being utilized. But what we do need to ensure is that Android Device Administrator, remember I said that our Teams devices utilize Android Device Administrator today. Platform needs to be set to allow, and personally owned also needs to be set to allow as well. Under minimum and max, we can put 8.0 under minimum because we don't have any Teams devices below 8.0 today. Now, maximum you can leave as blank. We are starting to support Android versions 12 and beyond currently at the moment. But typically we'll leave that blank because obviously we don't want to specify an upper range, but you can put one in there if you wish to. Now this device manufacturer field over here is used to block specific manufacturers from being able to enroll using this profile. So if perhaps you only want to allow Poly devices to enroll here and you want to block all others, you could perhaps put Crestron in here, Logitech in here, for example, if you wish. Entirely up to yourself. But once that's set up there, I can go ahead and click Next. We won't worry about scope tags because they're not required here. But we do need to have an assignment group assigned here. So we need to include a group that contains all of our list of users that this policy or this restriction policy will be assigned to. So if I go Add Group over here, and we go Groups, now I'm going to choose one that I created earlier called BNE Phones. That group contains a list of all of the users that will be signing in to my desk phones. I could also include my BNE MTR-A group here as well, which is our Brisbane MTR Android group here as well. So I'll go ahead and select both of those. What we're saying here is that anyone who's part of that group or that group will be allowed to enroll as part of this restriction policy. So let's go next. This just confirms the details that we're going to create. So go ahead and hit create. And there we go. Our policy is then created. So you can see it's been listed here as priority number 3. Now just be aware that these priorities can be moved around. I can move number 3 up to the top there if I want to by dragging and dropping this if I wish to. So I can do that and drop that up there. And you can see now that that then becomes priority 1. Now what those priorities mean is that the enrollment restrictions happen in priority order. So if I have a deny up here and then I have an allow down here, because the deny sits above the allow, the user won't be allowed to enroll. So just make sure that your priorities are set with allows first, followed by denies at the bottom. Cool. All right, let's talk about compliance policies in Intune. So Intune compliance policies allow us to configure a number of different things to control how the device looks and feels and whether or not it's compliant and able to sign in past conditional access. So to create a new compliance policy, we jump across to devices and then compliance policies. You can see I have a number here already, but what I'm going to go ahead and do is create a new one for our desk phones. So I'm going to go ahead and hit create policy. Remember that we need to choose Android Device Administrator today, so we're going to choose that and go create. Now we need to give this a name, so I'll call this demo phone compliance policy. I'm going to go next. Now, we're given a whole bunch of different compliance settings here that we can change. Now, by default, all of the information that's contained within here is perfectly fine to assign to our handsets and meeting room devices. So you don't need to update any of this information. Now, of course, if you want to potentially, for example, set the minimum and maximum OS version, or other things that you may wish to turn on or off in here, you can, but you need to first of all ensure that the policy settings that you're changing are supported. So not all of them are supported on our devices. If you go to aka.ms/MTR compliance, that'll take you to a page that looks like this. Just scroll down to the supported device compliance policy section. So you can see here that they're split up based on OS. So if I go Teams phones and displays, or Teams rooms on Android, this will give us all of the supported policies and items that we can turn on inside our compliance policy. So again, not everything is supported. For example, blocking apps from unknown sources is not supported in our compliance policy for our phones. So that's just something to take into account if you do want to come in and make changes to this default compliance policy. Just make sure that it matches what we have documented there. For now though, I'm happy with this compliance policy. I'm just going to hit next. Now we'll leave the device as marked device non-compliant and we'll leave that as 0 days. That way, if the device isn't compliant with our compliance policy, it will end up being non-compliant, which means then if we configure a conditional access policy to deny logon for that device, the device will not be able to sign in. So we'll go next. Next, we actually need to assign it to our group of users. So that's the users that will be signing into these devices. So again, I'm going to choose my BNE phones users list. I could also choose my my Android list up here as well if I wanted to include that too. But I called the policy phones, and I'm targeting phones, so I'm going to leave it as BNE phones. All right, so we'll go next. And lastly, obviously, we can review what we're just about to create. We're pretty happy with everything here, so we're going to go ahead and hit create. And that will go ahead and create our Android policy here. So if we go back to compliance policies, there's our policy that we just created there. Awesome. Okay, so that's Intune done. Let's now talk a little bit about conditional access and the bits and pieces that we need to set and change within conditional access to support and potentially better harden our handsets and meeting room devices as well. So we'll jump back to Edge here and I'll jump across to Azure AD this time. Now, the easiest way to access conditional access is just to literally type conditional access up here. There it is. This will take us over to conditional access, and we'll jump across to policies first of all. Okay, so we don't have any policies within our demo environment. Now, your environment will more than likely have a number of conditional access policies existing here already. So we're going to go ahead and create a new policy here. Now, we need to give it a name first of all, so I'm just going to call this demo allow phones to sign in. The next thing we need to do is we need to assign this policy to the users that it will affect. So we'll jump across to users, select users and groups. We're going to go select users and groups. And as our window pops up here on the right-hand side, we're going to choose, you guessed it, BNE phones. And we're going to go select. Next, we need to select our resources that the users will be signing into so that the conditional access policy takes effect. So we jump across the target resources. We're going to go select apps, select, and then on the right-hand side here, we're going to choose Office 365, which includes all the Office 365 apps, including Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams. And we're going to type Intune up here to show us Microsoft Intune and Intune Enrollment as well. Okay, and I'll just make sure that I actually selected Office 365 there, which I didn't. So there we go. I'll add that one there. Cool. Let's have a look at our conditions. So we have a look at sign-in risk, not configured here, so that's perfectly fine for our environment. Device platform, we can go ahead and configure this and say, well, we're only signing in from Android devices, so that's what we're going to allow here. We could also configure trusted locations if we want to. So say, for example, we want to say these handsets are only allowed to sign in when they're in the office, which is a trusted location from a trusted location public IP address. We could configure this and turn on trusted locations here. We could also select what locations are allowed here as well. What that essentially would do is, in the event of someone attempting to sign into one of these phones from external to the office perhaps, conditional access would step in and say, you're not coming from a trusted location, you're not allowed to sign in. Client apps we'll leave as is, we don't need to configure that. But what we could also do is we could configure additional device settings here to filter for specific devices via manufacturer, for example. So we could add a regular expression to only allow sign in from manufacturer equals poly, for example. All right, now we need to grant access to this, meaning that we want to require that the device be marked as compliant to be able to sign in. Remember before we said that with our compliance policy, if the device is non-compliant, mark it so. And then with it, by ticking this box inside of conditional access, we're saying that if the device is not compliant, we're not going to allow it to sign in. So that enables a level of additional security there. Okay, and the last thing we need to do is turn our policy on and go to create. And I'll go ahead and create our conditional access policy there. Awesome. Now, if you need to figure out what conditional access policies are supported with your Teams Room and Teams Phone devices, you can access that same URL, which is aka.ms/mtr compliance. That will take you to this page here. And if you just scroll down, this will show you all the supported conditional access policies on Windows, Android, and phones as well. So just ensure that things obviously that you're turning on inside of conditional access, just make sure they are supported so you know they're not going to cause problems with your Teams Room devices. Okay, now speaking of problems, the last thing I wanted to touch on is common issues when it comes to enrolling and managing these devices. So there are a number of things that I do often see when it comes to enrollment failures or sign-in failures with these devices. The first one is essentially around the device failing to sign in. So that could be a phone or a meeting room device. Now, quite often when the device fails to sign in, it's often caused by a Intune enrollment policy failure. Or a conditional access policy that stepped in and said, no, the phone's not allowed to sign in. Now, of course, it is entirely possible that the phone's not able to communicate with the service via those URLs. So if you want to make sure that the device has access to all those URLs, you can go to aka.ms/m365 URLs. That's a list that I maintain for Teams devices. Check that out. Just make sure that you give that to your firewall team and say, hey, just want to make sure that all these URLs are accessible from the phone and meeting room subnets, first of all. Once you confirm that, of course, you can then ensure that your Intune enrollment policies are allowing the devices to enroll. What I typically see is that enrollment failures occur due to the compliance policy or enrollment restriction policy being too strict. typically around Android OS versions. So just make sure that Android OS versions are set correctly, and of course that you've enabled Android Device Administrator as well. Just to that point as well, if the phone obviously can sign in from home but not from the office, typically that's an issue with the service URLs being blocked or a proxy being sat between the device and our service. So remember I said that from an ideal point of view, you would remove the proxy, you'd bypass it for your Teams devices. Of course, if that isn't possible, just make sure that you have disabled SSL inspection or decrypt and re-encrypt on any Office 365 URL. Now, it isn't necessary really to do that SSL decrypt and re-encrypt, but if you are doing that, just make sure you do turn it off for any Teams-related traffic. And lastly, you've got issues with sign-ins. So the device will actually sign in but fail to enroll in Intune. And again, this is often caused by a device enrollment restriction policy that's causing the problem, or the fact that Android Device Administrator hasn't been turned on and enabled. Now, there's a couple of tools that you can utilize within Intune to figure out if there is a problem with enrollment. The first one is the monitor tool. So if you jump across to devices and then monitor, you're going to want to scroll down and select enrollment failures, which is this one here, and then go to select a user. Now I'm going to use one of my my test accounts, so let's use Bianca, for example. We'll go to select. The account that you choose there will be the account that's having problems enrolling. So I've just chosen Bianca there. Now, if Bianca was having problems enrolling, you would see information show up here. It would say the date, what the failure was. It would say Android here, the OS version, the username, which would be Bianca, and it would give you a reason as to why the device failed to enroll and steps on how to rectify that. So that's a really good place to check, first of all. If you are using this tool, though, just be aware that there is about a 15 to 20 minute lag between when the failed enrollment has occurred and when the data will start showing up here. So just make sure you don't check straight away, otherwise you'll get some false positives here. So it's always a good idea to wait for at least 15 to 20 minutes between failing to sign in or enroll and then checking the monitor for enrollment failures here. The other useful tool is the Azure AD sign-in log. So if you jump across to sign-ins here, you'll be able to see within the log itself exactly what's happening and who's signing in and where. What we can do is you can add a filter in here, and we can say username, and we'll just put our Bianca user. And go to apply. And I'm going to change the filter to be for last a month. So we can see there's been no interactive logins here where the user's been prompted, or as of yet, I can see it's actually still searching there a moment. So we'll give that a second to catch up with itself. Oh, there we go. Okay, so yes, we can see that in the last month we've had Bianca has signed in once. So an interactive sign-in is where a prompt has been presented to the user themselves and they've actually entered the username and password. Now, it is very normal to see a failure followed by a success. Don't be concerned if you do see that here. But of course, if you are seeing failures here, you can then jump into the failure. It'll give you a lot more information as to what caused the failure and whether or not conditional access was being applied, and if it prevented the user from signing in there as well. So two very useful, powerful tools that you can check in the event of obviously issues being caused with sign-in. Okay, and with that, that is the end of today's session. Now, if you do have any follow-up questions, you can reach me on Twitter at @cchiffers or jump across to the blog at blog.chiffers.com. But for now, thank you very much for joining today's session, and hopefully we'll see you in the next one.